Victoria Hale sat in the witness chair of Fairfax County Probate Court with her hands folded neatly in her lap and a paper cup of water sweating on the wooden rail in front of her. The room smelled like old varnish and copier toner, the kind of smell that lives in buildings that have seen too many arguments and too few apologies. The air felt dry and the lights overhead hummed like they were tired too. I kept my spine straight. I kept my face calm. I kept my eyes forward. Because in my family, silence was never treated like discipline, it was treated like guilt. Across the room, Richard Hale stood like he belonged there. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, a perfect suit, a perfect voice, the kind of voice that can turn any lie into something that sounds reasonable. He was not my father, he was my stepfather, and he had spent years practicing the art of sounding like a hero while he quietly wrote himself into the center of every story. He looked at the judge, then at the people seated behind the rail, then finally at me, as if I was a stain he could wipe away with one more sentence. He raised a folder like it was a flag. He said, "She is a ghost. She does not work. No income, no life. And now she wants my late wife's estate." He said she forged the will. He said she forged my wife's signature. He said it slowly, carefully, like he was placing stones on a grave. I did not flinch. I did not turn to the gallery to beg for sympathy. I took one small sip of water. It tasted like metal and dust. I set the cup down without a sound. Because I knew something Richard did not know. The forged will was not the crime. The crime was what it unlocked inside her trust. One beneficiary change request, one transfer attempt, and one compliance report that Richard did not know existed. And he definitely did not know who the judge was. Not just her title, not just her robe, but the kind of past that makes certain patterns impossible to hide. My name is Victoria Hale. I am 39 years old. I grew up in Northern Virginia where people learn early how to sound polished, how to smile through tension, and how to keep secrets behind pleasant conversations. I learned how to read a room the way other kids learned how to ride a bike. I learned early that in certain families the truth does not matter as much as who says it first, and who says it loudest, and who sounds the most confident while saying it. Richard thought he owned the narrative. He thought if he spoke first with that calm, righteous voice, the room would decide I was guilty before I ever opened my mouth. If that were you, would you defend yourself the second the lie landed, or let it get comfortable first? This was probate court, not criminal court. No dramatic jury, no grand speeches for strangers who decide guilt. Probate is quieter, colder, and in some ways it is worse, because it is about what people think you deserve after someone dies. It is about paperwork and signatures and intentions. It is about whether a final document is real, and whether a person who cannot speak anymore would recognize the choices that someone else is claiming they made. My mother had done what careful people do when they get older. She created a revocable living trust. She put the family home into it, and she put her investment account into it, a brokerage account that held savings she built over decades. It was not flashy money. It was not new money. It was old, careful money, the kind you build with patience and discipline and the fear of ever having to depend on someone who smiles while taking. A will is a story someone writes on paper. A trust is a system that moves assets by rules. My mother's rules were clear. The house stayed protected inside the trust. The investment account was to be distributed fairly after expenses were handled. She wanted me and my sister to have time to grieve, time to decide, time to breathe without someone forcing the locks to change the week after the funeral. Richard did not like time. Richard liked control. When my mother got sick, Richard got close in a way that looked devoted from the outside. He brought soup. He drove her to appointments. He sat beside her in waiting rooms and held her hand. People praised him. People said I was lucky to have him. People told me to appreciate him. What they did not see was how he controlled access, how he filtered phone calls, how he answered messages for her, how he started handling paperwork in the name of helping, then kept handling it because no one stopped him. Richard knew how to be seen. In Fairfax County, he knew the right charities. He knew the right small events with the right names on the invitation list. He shook the right hands. He smiled at the right people. He remembered first names like it was a talent, and people trust a man who remembers their name. At home, he was different. Not loud, not violent, just precise. He would adjust the story with a soft voice, and then look at you like you were unreasonable for resisting. He would move pieces around the board and then act surprised when you realized you were trapped. My sister Lydia liked him. Lydia always liked what was easy. Lydia liked peace that cost someone else. Lydia has a way of looking innocent, even when she is holding the knife. She smiles while she asks questions that are really accusations. She says she just wants everyone to get along while she stands behind the person causing the war. I work contract compliance analysis for regulated institutions, the kind of work you do quietly, the kind you do behind screens and systems. Richard called it my little computer work. In court, he called it nothing at all. There were days I drove into Fairfax, parked on the street, and sat in my car with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house I grew up in, waiting for a sign that I was welcome inside. Some days, Richard would open the door and stand there, blocking the hallway behind him, smiling like a polite guard. He would say she is resting. He would say the doctor said no stress. He would say you can leave flowers, I will bring them to her. And the worst part was that sometimes he sounded reasonable. Sometimes I almost believed I was the problem. That is what people like Richard do. They make the cage feel like your choice. I did get inside sometimes. When I did, the house felt smaller, like the air had been rearranged. Pictures of me and my mother that used to sit in the hallway had moved. Not removed, just moved, like someone was testing how much erasing they could do without being noticed. My mother would be in her chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, eyes tired but still sharp. When Richard stepped out of the room, she would squeeze my hand and whisper that she was fine. She would say Richard worries too much. She would say Lydia is trying. She would say I should not make things harder. Even then, she was still mothering everyone else. Even then, she was still trying to keep peace in a house that no longer felt like hers. On my last visit before she died, I noticed her checkbook was gone from the drawer where she always kept it. I noticed her laptop was not on the side table anymore. I noticed a new file organizer in the living room with labels that were not in her handwriting. When I asked, Richard said he was organizing. He said it like a kindness. He said it like the world should thank him for controlling what was not his. My mother died on a gray morning when the trees outside were still bare, the kind of morning that feels unfinished. Richard called me after it happened. Not before. After. He told me to come to the house for a family meeting. He said it like a business appointment. When I arrived, Lydia was already there, sitting close to him on the couch like she belonged to his side now. Richard had papers spread out on the coffee table. He had a folder. He had a calm expression that looked like grief from a distance. He told me my mother had updated her will. He told me she wanted to protect him because he had taken care of her. He told me she had concerns about my stability because I had not been around enough. He did not say that I was missing. He said I was absent. Missing sounds like someone might care. Absent sounds like a moral failing. I asked to see the new will. Richard slid it across the table. The signature looked like my mother's name, but it did not look like her hand. My mother had a slight tremor in the last years. She used to joke about it when she signed holiday cards, the pen shaking just a little, the line of her last name wobbling like a small wave. This signature was smooth. Too smooth. Like it belonged to someone who had practiced it. I looked up. Richard smiled. Lydia watched me like she was waiting for me to explode so she could say I was unstable. I did not explode. I asked questions. Richard answered with rehearsed patience. Lydia added little comments like salt on a wound. She said you were never here. She said Mom was always worried about you. She said Richard did everything, you should be grateful. Grateful. For what? For being boxed out of my own mother's last months. For being handed a document that felt wrong, and being told to accept it with a smile. I asked about the trust. My mother had always talked about the trust. Richard waved his hand and said the will covers it. He said it with confidence, like he expected me not to know the difference. Like he expected me not to understand that mixing them up is what people do when they are counting on your ignorance. Lydia leaned forward and said we should not fight. She said Mom would not want this. She said we should honor her wishes. She said wishes, not rules. Wishes are flexible. Rules are not. That night I went home and opened my laptop. I pulled old emails from my mother. I looked at pictures of her handwriting. I compared them to the signature on the will. I felt my stomach turn, not from grief, but from clarity. Richard had done something. Maybe not with his own hands, but with his direction, with his pressure, with his timing. I did not call him to accuse him. I did not give him a chance to adjust the story. I called an attorney. Daniel Cross was not the kind of lawyer Richard usually hired. Richard liked local performers, men who smiled and made jokes in court, men who acted like the judge was their old friend. Daniel Cross was the opposite. He was quiet. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was clean and sharp. Daniel asked for documents. He asked for the trust paperwork. He asked for account statements. He asked for every version of every will we could find. He asked for the timeline of my mother's illness. He asked for the name of the notary listed on the new will. He asked for everything. Then he told me something I already knew in my bones. People who forge documents usually leave a trail somewhere else because forgery is rarely a single act, it is a key. It unlocks doors. And doors lead to rooms with cameras and logs and rules. He also told me something that made me stop breathing for a second. He said your stepfather does not need to win on paper to cause damage. He only needs to get one institution to treat a request as credible long enough to move something. He said once money moves, it becomes harder to pull back. He said that is why compliance systems exist, and why liars hate them. We filed in probate court to contest the will. Richard responded like he had been waiting for it. He hired Harold Bennett. Harold Bennett was exactly what you imagine when you picture a confident local lawyer who thinks the courtroom is a stage. He wore bright ties. He spoke loudly. He smiled at the judge as if she was there to watch him win. The first hearing was not about truth. It was about framing. It was about who looked credible in the first few minutes. Richard came in wearing black like a mourning husband. He placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder like a father. He nodded politely at the clerk. He looked at me with sadness like I had done this to him. Bennett spoke first. He did not talk forever. He did not need to. He offered a simple picture. He said my mother made a thoughtful update near the end of her life. He said my mother wanted to protect the household that cared for her. He said this dispute was fueled by resentment. Then Richard took the stand and made sure the room heard the part he cared about. He said, "She is a ghost." He said, "She comes and goes." He said, "She never committed to anything." He said, "And now she wants the estate." He did not repeat it again and again. He did not need to. He said it once and he let the silence do the rest. People in the gallery shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Someone adjusted a coat. The room did not gasp like a movie. It just leaned quietly toward the story that was being handed to it. Bennett then suggested motive. He said money. He said my mother had an investment account that had grown over the years. He said she had a home in a valuable area. He said it was natural that a person like me would want it. Someone like me. A ghost. An opportunist. Richard looked at the judge and spoke with practiced pain. He said, "I hate to say this, Your Honor, but I believe Victoria forged that will and tried to steal from her own mother." He had no idea how hard I had trained myself not to react. He thought my silence meant shame. Daniel Cross sat beside me still as stone. His pen did not move. His eyes did not blink fast. He was waiting. This is the moment I remembered the sentence I promised myself on the drive to court. The forged will was not the crime. The forged will was the key. Because here is what Richard did not understand. A forged will is not useful by itself. It becomes useful when you carry it to the places that hold the assets, and you use it as the reason to change who gets paid, and who gets access, and who gets to move money. He could not rewrite the trust itself on his own, so he tried the next thing, using the forged will to pressure the brokerage into treating the account instructions as if the estate plan had changed. He was trying to get the brokerage to treat the account instructions as changed before any court ever confirmed the will. Richard took that forged will and he treated it like a master key. He used it to justify requests. He used it to support paperwork. He used it to tell institutions the plan had changed. And that is where compliance lives. Compliance lives where keys get tested. When it was our turn, Daniel stood and asked permission to approach. He did not smile. He did not flatter. He spoke like a man who had already done the work and did not need to impress anyone with noise. He said, "Your Honor, we have an exhibit filed under seal." He said it was filed under seal due to bank compliance escalation and ongoing review. He said the exhibit relates to attempted changes and movement of assets connected to the trust's investment account. Bennett gave a short laugh like he could laugh evidence out of existence. He said, "This is probate court, not a thriller." Daniel did not react. He only looked at the judge and waited. Judge Eleanor Whitmore was not a dramatic woman. She had a calm face that did not give away emotion. She listened the way people listen when they are used to sorting truth from performance. She looked down at the sealed filing, then looked up at Daniel. She asked one question, simple and measured. "Counsel, is this a bank compliance escalation summary?" Daniel said, "Yes, Your Honor." He said the bank compliance department documented unusual activity tied to the account. He said the summary includes access logs and a sequence of requests that do not match normal patterns. The judge nodded once. She instructed the clerk to handle the exhibit. She told Bennett he would have an opportunity to respond after the court reviewed what was filed. Richard shifted in his seat, but he still looked confident. People like Richard think confidence is a weapon. Sometimes it is until it becomes proof of arrogance. The clerk brought the sealed document forward. The judge reviewed it quietly for a long moment. The courtroom was so still that I could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Then the judge looked up, and her eyes went to Richard, not like a judge looking at a party, but like someone hearing something familiar and deciding not to ignore it. She said, "Mr. Hale," calmly, like she was confirming a detail for herself. Richard smiled, the same small smile he uses when he thinks a room will protect him. The judge looked back down at the sealed report, then up again, and asked Daniel to proceed. Daniel walked to the center of the room and spoke with the same calm rhythm. He explained that the investment account inside the trust had records, and those records told a story that did not match Richard's story. He said the compliance summary documents access to the account from credentials linked to Richard's household profile. He said it documents a beneficiary change request that occurred shortly after that access. He said it documents a transfer attempt that referenced the new will as justification. He said the transfer attempt was stopped by compliance controls pending review. He paused and let the room understand the shape of it. Then he did not try to be clever. He did not try to sound exciting. He did what honest people do when they have proof. He asked clean questions. He turned toward Richard and asked, "Mr. Hale, did you or anyone acting at your direction submit the new will to the brokerage or request that they update estate instructions?" Richard's jaw tightened. He said, "I was managing everything for her." Daniel nodded. Then he asked, "Did you request a beneficiary change?" Richard said, "My wife wanted me taken care of." Daniel asked, "Did your wife instruct you in writing with proper witness support to make that change?" Richard hesitated. Bennett objected, but the objection lacked energy. The judge overruled with a simple gesture. Richard said she signed the updated will. Daniel said, "And that will appeared shortly before she died, correct?" Richard said yes. Daniel said, "And the beneficiary change request was submitted right after account access linked to your credentials, correct?" Richard said, "I do not know what you are talking about." Daniel looked down at the compliance report. He described the sequence in plain words: access, change, request, transfer, attempt, stop. He did not read out technical codes. He did not need to. He was building a staircase the judge could walk up without stumbling. Richard tried to talk faster. He tried to sound offended. He said, "Are you accusing me of something in probate court?" Daniel said, "I am showing the court a documented sequence of activity. The sequence exists whether you feel offended or not." Lydia's tissue stopped moving. Her eyes widened slightly like she was hearing her own name in a sentence she did not expect. And then Daniel turned to the Lydia piece, but he did it in a way that could not be questioned. He said the compliance summary includes the submission email used to send the scanned will for processing, along with the forwarded chain attached to it. He said the submission originated from Victoria Hale. Lydia's face changed, not dramatically, just enough. Enough for anyone paying attention to see it. Bennett spoke quickly. Too quickly. He said that proves nothing. Daniel said it proves involvement. He said it proves coordination. He said it proves the story being told here is not a misunderstanding, it is a plan. Daniel continued. He said the notary listed on the new will was contacted. He said the notary denies witnessing that signing. He said the notary denies meeting my mother on the date listed. He said the notary denies placing their seal on that document. A quiet movement passed through the gallery, not shock, more like understanding arriving in the room. Richard stared straight ahead. Lydia stared at the table. Bennett stopped smiling. Daniel said, "Your Honor, we requested a comparison using verified signatures from brokerage records and prior estate documents." He said the result indicates the signature on the contested will does not match. He said it shows characteristics consistent with a traced forgery rather than natural variation. I watched the room shift. It is subtle when people change their minds. They do not announce it. They simply stop leaning toward the lie. The judge looked at Richard. She looked at him the way a person looks at a locked door after hearing a key turn on the other side. She asked Richard a quiet question. "Mr. Hale, are you aware that submitting a forged estate document to influence access and distribution can implicate fraud issues beyond a standard probate dispute?" Richard swallowed. He said, "I am just trying to honor my wife." The judge did not respond to the sentiment. She responded to the pattern. She removed her glasses and set them carefully on the bench like a person preparing to speak plainly. She said, "Mr. Hale, stop performing for this courtroom." She said, "This court is here to protect estates from unlawful interference." She said, "Documentation matters here." Then she said the part that made the title real. She said, "I know your name, Mr. Hale." She said, "Before I took this bench, I served as a federal prosecutor in this region." She said, "I prosecuted a financial fraud case that involved a charity account and forged documentation, and you sat in the front row of that courtroom smiling for cameras while the money trail told the truth." Richard's face tightened like someone had pulled a string. The judge said, "I remember how quickly you spoke then, too." She said, "I remember how confident you were that your reputation would carry you past evidence." The room did not gasp. The room went still. She looked at Daniel and said the sealed compliance summary on its face reflects a fraud pattern. She said the court does not need to discuss protected reporting details to take protective action, but the court is not blind to what it is reading. Then she looked back at Richard. She said, "What you have described as a family disagreement appears based on this record to be an attempt to use a forged will as leverage to alter and access trust-related assets." She said the probate matter is stayed pending further review. She said no transfers, no access, no changes, and no disposal of the property or account assets will be permitted. She instructed the clerk to document the stay. She instructed that all parties preserve records, communications, devices, and any drafts or versions of the contested will. She instructed that the parties provide full disclosure of estate-related communications. She instructed that the matter be referred for appropriate investigation based on the sealed compliance findings. And then she said one more sentence, a sentence that turned Richard's performance into a liability. She said, "Mr. Hale, you gave testimony today." She said, "If any part of it is knowingly false, you have created consequences for yourself beyond this court." Bennett tried to speak. He started with, "Your Honor." The judge lifted her hand. She said, "You will not interrupt this court." She said, "You will address evidence, not narratives." She said, "You will do so with care because what is filed here is under seal and connected to compliance escalation." The word seal hung in the air like a weight. Richard's face lost color. Not anger, not sadness. Something closer to fear, the fear of a man realizing his influence ends at the edge of a document he cannot charm. Lydia made a small sound, barely audible, like a breath catching. She looked at Richard, then looked away. Daniel sat down beside me. He did not celebrate. He did not whisper, "I told you so." He simply placed his folder on the table and looked forward as if this was the expected outcome of preparation. I kept my face calm because I did not want Richard to have the satisfaction of seeing relief as weakness. But inside, something unclenched. Something that had been tight since the day my mother died. The hearing ended with instructions and deadlines, the kind of boring words that suddenly feel beautiful when they are aimed at the right person. People stood. Chairs scraped. The bailiff announced the court was adjourned. And just like that, the room that had felt like a cage minutes earlier became a hallway leading outward. If quiet revenge is your kind of justice, subscribe and stay with me, because this was only the part he could see. Richard walked out with Bennett's shoulders, tense steps quick, no longer lingering to greet people. Lydia followed a half step behind, not touching his arm, now not looking at me. As I walked out, I passed the wooden doors that swallowed so many arguments over the years. Outside, the light was sharp. The air smelled like car exhaust in early spring. I stood on the steps for a moment and let the world be loud again. Daniel came beside me and spoke in a low voice. He said, "Do not engage them." He said, "Do not talk to Lydia." He said, "Let them panic. Panic makes people sloppy. Sloppy creates more proof." I nodded. I asked him if what the judge said about knowing Richard mattered. Daniel said it mattered because it removed his biggest weapon. He said Richard uses reputation like a shield. He said Judge Whitmore had already seen him near a fraud story once, and she was not impressed by his posture. Daniel told me the next steps would involve securing the trust assets, preventing any further access, and pursuing the will contest with the benefit of the compliance documentation. He said the sealed exhibit shifted the posture of the case. He said Richard would no longer be able to pretend this was only about feelings. That night I returned to my apartment and sat at my kitchen table with a single lamp on. The room was quiet. My phone stayed silent. For once, there were no new messages from Lydia, asking me to keep the peace. There were no calls from Richard pretending to be reasonable. I opened an old photo of my mother on my screen. She was smiling, holding a mug hair tucked behind her ear. She looked like someone who would be furious if she knew what had been done in her name. I did not cry then. Not because I could not, but because I was tired of giving my tears to people who used them as proof that I was weak. Instead, I wrote down the timeline. The day the new will appeared. The day the account was accessed. The day the beneficiary change request was submitted. The day the transfer attempt was stopped. The day the notary denied the signing. The day Lydia's submission email became part of the record. Every step that turned a lie into a trace. This is the part people do not like to talk about. Revenge is not screaming. Revenge is record-keeping. Revenge is patience. Revenge is letting the truth build weight until it crushes the performance. Days later, whispers started. In Fairfax County, whispers travel faster than cars. People who had smiled at Richard at charity events now looked away. People who had praised him for caregiving now asked quiet questions. Not because they suddenly became moral, but because curiosity is the beginning of doubt. A neighbor who once told me Richard was a saint stopped me outside a grocery store and asked if things were okay. She asked it softly, like she was trying not to step on a crack in the sidewalk. I said, "We are letting the court handle it." I watched her nod like she understood, and I watched her eyes move away from mine, like she had just realized she had been wrong in public. Lydia tried to call. I let it ring. She texted about family. She said we should talk. She said this is tearing everyone apart. She did not mention the will. She did not mention the notary denial. She did not mention the compliance summary. She did not mention the submission email. She mentioned feelings because feelings are easier to manipulate than facts. I did not respond. Bennett filed motions. He argued the sealed exhibit should be limited. He argued probate should not be influenced by compliance language. He argued the court should focus only on the document itself. Daniel responded with calm clarity. He said the document cannot be separated from the attempt to use it. He said the court does not have to discuss protected reporting details to take protective action. He said the court has a duty to protect the estate and stop potential harm. Judge Whitmore kept the case on rails. At the next appearance, Richard looked different. Still dressed well, still polite, but the confidence had holes. He spoke less. Bennett spoke less. Daniel spoke only when necessary. The judge asked for documentation of the contested will's creation. She asked for drafts for communications, for who arranged the notary for where the signing took place. She asked for device preservation confirmation. Richard produced what he could. Some things did not exist. Some things contradicted each other. The more they tried to explain, the more the story sounded like something assembled after the fact. The truth does not need creativity. Lies do. The court ordered continued protection of the trust assets. The investment account stayed frozen against changes. The house remained within trust control. No sale, no refinance, no quiet transfer, no attempt to use the property as leverage. Richard lost what he cared about most. Not the money. Control. Because for men like Richard, control is oxygen. Take it away, and they begin to suffocate on their own words. I wish I could tell you it ended with a dramatic confession. It did not. People like Richard rarely confess. They negotiate. They deflect. They blame. But the story did end with something better than a confession. It ended with consequences. The will he claimed was authentic became the center of scrutiny. The notary denial became a problem he could not smile away. Lydia's submission email became a stain she could not wash off with a gentle voice. The compliance sequence became a documented issue. The beneficiary change request became a highlighted act. His performance became irrelevant. And I kept something too, something I had not held in years. My name, my mother's intent, my own sense of reality. When you survive a person like Richard, the biggest gift is not the money. It is the moment you stop doubting your own memory. It is the moment you realize you were not unstable, you were simply trapped inside someone else's narrative. If you are living in a house where someone controls the story, start keeping your timeline. Save your emails. Screenshot your messages. Document what you can. You do not have to weaponize it. You only have to preserve it. The day will come when preservation becomes power. Weeks later, I passed the courthouse again, not for a hearing, just passing by on an errand. I saw the steps where I had stood that first day, swallowing anger while Richard called me a ghost. I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because my mother was back, not because Lydia suddenly became loyal, but because I had stopped asking permission to be believed. I had spent enough of my life answering people who only called me when the record turned against them. If you would stay for one more story where the truth lands harder than the lie, subscribe and tell me this. Would you answer Lydia, or let the silence finish it?